Hi, everyone. Welcome to my third podcast episode of Athena's Wellness Wisdom. And so I'm super happy today to have Ben Tannahill with me. And Ben and I have actually been working together. He's a somatic therapist based out of the UK. And we've been doing sessions together since about June, I'd say. So a lot of my actual real deep inner healing work has, been happening alongside my sessions with Ben. So it's kind of he's definitely been the person to get me down into the deep and gritty parts. So I'm super happy to have him here. And Ben, can you just introduce yourself and maybe tell people what you do for a living?
Sure, sure. Thanks, Athena. Well, thanks for inviting me to talk with you. And well, mostly when people ask me what I do for a living, I say I help people to feel their feelings, which is sort of like I think most people can grasp what that is of just supporting people because we find it very difficult to feel our feelings. They're very painful, and we've never really been taught how to do that or given the support to do that by our teachers, our parents, or even know why it would be important. Most people sort of dismiss it as, why would I want to do that? Is feel my shame or sadness? That's why, what's the point of that? But turns out they're very, very important emotions in general and to feel and process and integrate them. And I support people to do that working one on one, which means, helping them to connect to their body, to feel safe enough in the body, because often it feels very unsafe to go near these painful or difficult or potentially threatening emotions, and guiding them to be with their experience in a way that it kind of unfolds how it wants to, so that people can really feel and fully allow their sadness or their shame or their anger, and then go away feeling a bit more integrated, a bit more whole, a bit lighter, maybe not quite so triggered by different situations and circumstances and people.
Yeah, so basically, like I did a lot of talk therapy before, like tried different people. And so what I really found useful about like finding you is, you had a bit of a YouTube presence first. I mean, we met together through a course that I got certified in recently, embodied processing. And so that is basically like a very trauma heavy course and talking about how we can process our emotions. And they kind of mentioned this bottom up approach. So it's feeling into the body first, and then you use the mind a bit to kind of, um, you know, to talk about what happens, to do belief investigation and stuff. And then we bring it into the body. And so it's just like, even after the first session and the first few sessions, like it felt so much more change able to happen, and I was able to go deeper and stuff. So, but like I said, when I found you on the website and everything, or on the group page, it's like you had this YouTube presence first. So it was like I could go in and see videos that you've done, and I could see, I could learn a little bit about you, and I could just, feel if we're going to resonate and just kind of see a little bit of mirroring, a little bit, similar age, whatever kind of things that drew me to you. And it's just, when you go and look for like a therapist out there in the world, you usually don't get that, that that ability to choose someone who you resonate with in that way. So it's just that's one thing that I found super helpful before I even met you. And then yeah, in our sessions, like just like you said, that building of trust is so important. And just to have that one person, so to do like a continued sessions, like we couldn't have just tapped into all that much stuff on the first session, it's like you need to kind of continue to go and work with someone and commit to work with somebody. So I'm just wondering also, like, how did you get into this somatics work, and just maybe a little bit about, what brought you to it?
Sure. Well, I could just briefly reflect something on what you're talking about, trust and safety. I think that's really, really key, and it's important to find the right person you kind of resonate with, even if, you know, that resonance or sense of reciprocity is more important than the actual technique itself, I would say. And you can really feel into that. If you imagine how you feel if you're sitting in a room with someone you don't trust. Like you can feel that maybe your throat closes up a bit, your body gets a little bit tense or starts to shut down slightly. They feel like a threat, and the body and mind close up in response to that. You know, or if you had a therapist, a practitioner who wasn't really listening to you or paying attention to you, you can feel that you sense that very, very quickly, and it shut. You close off as a result. Whereas if you know how if you when you're with friends who you feel have really supporting you, and then you can feel that they love you no matter what's going on for you, there's so much more openness there in you, right? And it's that latter state that we try, ideally we're going towards in a therapy session, which is why the right person's so important. The different people have different, you feel slightly more open with someone, even if they're both just as skilled. I don't know, there's just some kind of sixth sense we have, for different people. As for how I got into this work, it came onto my radar when, in my 20s, I was an alcoholic. I couldn't stop drinking alcohol. Looking back, it's from my teenage years, but it was about 23 or so. I think I admitted to myself when I was 23 years old. Yeah, okay, I can't stop. I have a problem here. And I mean, yeah, when you're drinking every day, it just let's just say that life, it's like going through life with the handbrake on. You know what I mean? It doesn't support the sort of optimal unfolding of your life and your potential. And it's a really painful place to be. And I struggled for a long time to overcome it, and without much success, trying a gazillion times to quit drinking. Um, Eventually I got some support on the NHS. I actually had an addiction therapist it was talk therapy, so it didn't get into the trauma and the body, the stuff I was carrying in the body, but I will say it did provide a bit of a space for me to think about the problems I was having. And then I kind of, when I was 28 years old, I kind of hit the wall. I remember I had a big bender, and from memory of as my friend was throwing a party. It wasn't like a massive party. She was leaving to go to South America and had a gathering of all her friends. And I was drunk when I arrived. And then I remember there were all these mattresses where everyone was supposed to sleep, and I threw up across them all. And that was when something changed. I remember standing in the train station next day, and I felt something had shifted. Like my body had just had enough. And so I stopped drinking. I started going to AA. But what really shifted was then there was this movement. Okay, how I still felt all the pain. I still felt so anxious. What was really driving the addiction, I found out later on, was lots of anxiety, and underneath that there was a huge amount of repressed anger, in particular, as well as shame and sadness and hurt and all sorts of kinds of things. But anger was the one that when I started feeling that through, I really felt things starting to shift and change and relax. Um, but I'll maybe get to that in a moment. Um, and I started meditating loads. I got into spirituality and meditation, became obsessed with that. But rather like with talk therapy, the meditation doesn't really get to the emotions or the trauma or the stress, the tension that the body is holding. Some people meditate for decades, and they keep they're kind of calm, but that's only because the meditations help them actually disconnect from their body. Um, More so. And I think for me, it helped. I did some Vipassana meditation, which is like body scanning, which can open things up. It can go either way with Vipassana. It depends how you do it. I think for some people it numbs them out to their body because when you get so granular with your attention, like in Vipassana, they make you go centimeter by centimeter across your skin. That can actually um, help you actually numb out or regulate away emotional content, um, rather than actually go more deeply into it. But after a while of doing this, I eventually stumbled upon someone talking about it was Scott Killaby talking about addiction and trauma, and then I started joining the dots. I was like, oh, there's a reason why I was drinking. It was the first time I'd heard that actually it was the stuff, the emotions, the trapped, all the tension, the protective tension in the body that was actually looking to be soothed by all the alcohol that I was drinking. And then I started investigating different somatic approaches, and I remember in my second session I started crying, and I felt relief for the first time. It was like real relief came as these tears, and then there was a spaciousness afterwards, just a bit of space. And I'm sure all the meditation had helped me become much more mindful and become more aware of my body and things like that, and noticing my thoughts and such, which is really important skills to have in place for this kind of thing. But it wasn't until I actually started going into the body that I was like, oh, I could feel something actually move and shift and transform. Because and suddenly the penny dropped as my pain, as I kept doing it more, my pain kept coming to the surface. There's just more stuff coming up from over here and over here. The penny starts dropping. It's like, oh, this is what's been going on the entire time. It wasn't because I was crazy. It wasn't because there was something wrong with me. It wasn't just because I liked beer. I could start to feel all these really intense, painful energies come to the surface. Particularly when I started going into all the anger, there was so much anger, and it made so much sense to me. It's like, Jesus, no wonder I wanted to have a drink to like, oh, just because there's this volcano, this fire within you that's so painful, and your body's like, I'd obviously learned at some point in my childhood that I just can't express that. Like I can't express my needs, I can't express my anger. And I was a very anxious, introverted person as a teenager. I just learned to lock it all down, not telling anyone what was going on. And all that rage, it's just so painful to hold all that rage, that volcano in that, I'd have a drink and the whole thing would relax. It's like, oh, thank God. So that was kind of the penny dropped. And then I just started going into it more and more. I did some training courses, took more sessions for myself. And then there was like the pandemic, and that was a great opportunity to really dive into it when you have nothing else to do but to sit on Zoom with people doing somatic therapy. So I traded lots of sessions with folks. And then there's more to the where the story goes, but that's kind of how I got into it. And the penny dropped, like I said, that this is what's actually is really transforming and helping me. And so the more I did it, the generally speaking, the lighter I would feel. And there were more addiction issues. It's not like it all went away. I then started when I stopped drinking, I was binging chocolate every day for years, which is better than the drinking, but still not great. Still dealing with the gut issues from that one to this day. Um, but that's and there's ups and downs to it, right? You go through phases, some really difficult phases, and then some when you'll feel lighter. But overall, the trajectory was like freeing up all these emotions, and then I felt more space in the body. My mind gets quieter and quieter and quieter. The beliefs start falling away. The triggers, the projections, the fantasies start falling away less. I find it harder for me to be triggered. Um, and you start to have certain spiritual insights, even mystical insights can come. But yeah, I'll maybe leave it there for the time being. And then I've just kept on exploring in that direction ever since.
Wow, thank you so much for sharing. Yeah, so what I'm hearing is basically this addiction to alcohol, and then you hit a limit, and then now it's time you've kind of came to a point where you're like, I need to look for something more, and just like get to the bottom of this. And you did bring up a good point that for me, I said I tried but like a talk therapy multiple times, and I felt like it did almost nothing for me other than the fact that I was able to tell somebody a little bit about my story, and it was like somebody actually, I pay them to listen, so they listen. But beyond that, it didn't do much for me. And so you bring up a good point that for you, that's what started you off. And so you kind of needed that along your healing journey. So it's just, bringing light to the fact that everybody's different and everybody's going to have a different journey and different things are going to work for different people. So it's so important to, if you try one and it doesn't work, then, try something else, try something completely different, and do your research and go out there and look. And so another thing I heard you say is like once you got this ball rolling, you just got so curious. And I think like that's a quality that I find in myself along this healing journey is just being so curious and like, well, why? Why does that happen? Or like, what can I feel and where can I go with this? And I think just that's such an important quality for people to have, like just get curious about things. And another thing you said in there, like brought up for me, it's like, I think I've told you this before, like I've had people in my life tell me I'm like the chillest person they know. And it's like, yeah, you say that, and I know that I could be chill on the outside, but on the inside, there was no chill, and it's just, and we
Yes.
talked about like I smoked weed for, since I was 15 until the time I got pregnant almost daily, right? So that was definitely attributed to the chill, but that's because I
It's a certain
just
kind of chill.
into like a master dissociator. And I was just like so good at dissociating. And so I remember in one of our sessions when we were talking about like smoking weed and I remember you said something along the lines of, do you only do it, for good? Like, does it only have good like, does it only do good in your life when you do it? Because I was trying to justify it, and I just kind of had to laugh and say, like, well, no, like, of course it's not only for good, right? So then it's like that cuts that conversation completely, and then it's like I was able to make that awareness that it was like just making me this master dissociator, basically, and like bringing me away from my body. But then, so then at that point, I cut it out. Like, I decided for myself I was going to cut it out because before I'd mentioned I stopped for almost 3 years from the time I got pregnant
Yeah.
until my daughter stopped breastfeeding. And then, then as soon as she turned two, I started again and I went for a solid month or two, like daily again. But now that I had already done so much healing, it wasn't landing the same way as it did before. So for me, it was like, okay, now I can see that, it helps me dissociate and stuff. But then at the same time, once I took that break on my own, now I can kind of go back and dabble in like and and do it purely for, the different kind of brain set it puts me in, and I can actually think about things in a different way. And, I have this different type of creativity and I can write things down and I'm actually doing it for a purpose. Whereas before it was
Hmm.
literally just to help my body dissociate. And now it's kind of like I go into that and I can do it, maybe once a week or whenever I choose, it's not, I don't find it an addiction anymore. And it's like I can actually use it as a means to heal some of the processing and the dissociation that I was feeling before doing a bit of self-healing. So I'm just curious if you'd feel comfortable talking about, like, I know you talk about psychedelics a little bit as healing. Just curious if you mind talking to that a little bit.
Yeah. Well, I'm a fan of psychedelics personally. They've been very insightful and helpful for me. They're quite I think they can be used in many different ways, so they're quite a complex topic. And weed also in particular, marijuana is kind of notorious as being quite a slippery one. You can absolutely use it in a beneficial constructive capacity because it does, like other psychedelics, it can give you insights, it can take you deeper into yourself, but it's the most slippery for being able to use it as a way of dissociating. It's kind of known in the in sort of other cultures, I think South American culture, where they're more steeped in sort of plant medicine. It's known as a particularly like a bit of a trickster, um, one to be wary of. For that reason you kind of describe, you can very easily justify and slip into just like, I'm doing all this healing work. I'm not suggesting you're doing this, but it's just a slippery one to slip into. Okay, so you've got to be very clear and discerning, and it's okay to use it for whatever reason, but you just want to make sure you know what's happening. That okay, I know I'm using this for recreation now, and when I'm using it this way, I'm using it for healing. But the way they seem to be beneficial is that they function as like amplifiers of your consciousness, psychedelics in general. So what prevents you from accessing deeper parts of your unconscious is sort of the layers of identity and mental concepts that we have of ourselves and others in the world. It creates this kind of like cage of thought that one of the functions of which is to defend us from our deeper unconscious or the collective unconscious or from certain aspects of our own mind and body and emotions. And when we take psychedelics, it almost like burns through some of that temporarily. And in this hole or the space that's created, other new stuff can flow up to the surface. And then when we process that through, it's like almost deeper emotions or things we haven't seen can come to the surface. And when we process that through, that's sort of the opportunity for healing. So let me slow down a bit and go back to this sort of whole metaphor. So I on my YouTube channel, there's an interview from a few years ago with Prajna O'Hara, who's a medicine woman who I've been on retreat with many times, and she often says ayahuasca helps you see in the dark, right? That's exactly that. When your sense of self starts to soften, your fixed view of reality softens. You can suddenly see in the dark, down into the depths, and stuff comes up that you wouldn't otherwise have been able to access, or at least not without years of therapy or meditation or whatever. So it very quickly brings up this stuff. And that's the opportunity for healing because these deep wounds can come up and you can meet them, you can process them and integrate them, using different somatic skills that you hope you might have, or just holding on for dear life in some cases and making your way through it. So that's the opportunity that they bring is they can bring up a lot of stuff very quickly. That's also the danger because you can you can flood your nervous system very easily if you take too big a dose. Suddenly, your nervous system can't handle the amount of energy and emotion or mental imagery that's coming to the surface. You can start to panic, freak out, resist, and that's when bad trips happen. When people feel really trapped and stuck, it's just there's too much has come up, they can't handle it, and their mind, their body starts resisting it. Which is why people have to be careful with it because although there's the reward is great, the potential risk is also great as a result.
Yeah.
Um, then when you process things through, that's sort of the first half of a trip. Trend tends to be this purificatory phase where you're processing these things through that have come up to the surface. And then the second half, if you sort of successfully navigate that, you tend, and this is just a general rule, it can play out in many different ways, tend to move into what they can call the ecstatic phase, where suddenly you burst through into a much more spacious, altered state of consciousness of some kind. And this is where you can have insights. Because there's more space now, you're more kind of connected to your own unconscious, collective unconscious, reality as a whole, and the intelligence that that brings. And in this state of greater connectedness, you can have deeper insights into your own life, some personal thing to do with a relationship or something, or what you should do, your purpose, or some aspect of your personality or psyche, or to do with reality itself. Like, what is reality? What is the I that we take ourselves to be? What's going on here? Insights of that nature, and then you can have sort of more ineffable mystical experiences as well in those states. And so those, yeah, for those reasons, they're all reasons that I use psychedelics personally and sort of find them a fascinating topic because there is more potential for healing, I think, than people let on. Often people talk about, oh, you just do psychedelics and then you kind of like you see some cool stuff for a while and then that's it. But I think they can. I've had very deep healing experiences with ayahuasca, for example, is one where there's a lot of knowledge has been gained in indigenous societies around how to use that for healing. With San Pedro as well, but you can use any psychedelic if you know how to in the right way. You can use any psychedelic to actually bring up emotion, repressed emotion, trauma, and heal it if you have the right intention, and maybe a bit of skill as well. And also, then there's the whole mystical, altered state of consciousness side, which is really interesting.
Hmm. Yeah, for sure. It's funny when you said that, it kind of reminded me of like when I did mushrooms as a teenager, not thinking definitely purely recreational and not knowing what I was getting into and not ready for it at the time. But I remember that moment of
Yeah,
like, what is real? Like I still specifically can recall that. Like, what is real? Like, when will I be real again? Will I ever be real again? Like, how can I go back after being here now? And it's interesting. It's like those little bits and pockets, and it's like I feel like it kind of put itself in my brain somewhere, and then it's like later on, years and years later, when I'm researching spirituality, and I'm like, I'm contemplating like I am, like what am I, and what are we all, and are we all connected? It's like that little ping from way back when kind of, reminds me, and it's like, yeah, you can go into these altered states, and it's so interesting that, like you said, you kind of go into your own subconscious and stuff. So yeah, that's really
yeah.
cool. Just
So it's sowed a
yeah,
seed for you in some way, right? There is sowed a seed, even though
yeah,
sounds like perhaps an overwhelming experience at the time. It did sow a seed in the teenage
yeah,
Athena that's then bearing fruit later, decades down the road. That
yeah,
can happen. Yeah.
exactly. Yeah, I know. I do wonder, like, and we can talk about this too. Like, you can't heal your family, can't heal your friends, but I remember, like, I just wonder, like, me kind of delving on a little bit of mushrooms, trying a little bit of ecstasy when I was a teenager and, smoking the weed. And it's like now that I am, decades later, when I'm finally ready to like go on my own healing journey and just the amount of stuff that I processed and changed within me, it's like, did those little experiences sow seeds for later on? Because it's like my brothers who grew up, in very similar situations. Of course, we all have our own different takes. Even if you grow up in the same family, you can still have different kind of environmental takes on it. But they've never, they've still never tried to heal themselves at all. They never did drugs, and then they also never tried to heal themselves. Like I know they have different things that, like addictions and dissociation things and coping mechanisms. But I just find it interesting. It's like I feel like part of that is what that curiosity, because that's kind of why kids get into drugs. It's like a curiosity thing. It's like, is that curiosity which led into later life, which actually helped me down the healing path or not, like just kind of interesting musings that I have. So I don't know, like do
Yeah,
lots of healers, dabble in those things sometimes in their past, and that's kind of helps them get the ball rolling, or is it just that curiosity? Like I'm sure everybody on a healing path has that curiosity, I would have to imagine, right?
yeah. Well, I think there's surprising amount to say about that, and I'm not an expert, but what I do know is that humans are generally very drawn to altered states of consciousness. And in fact, animals in general, you'll know there are examples of, different dead monkeys and elephants
Hmm.
getting drunk or taking psychedelic plants that they find and
Yeah.
really and seeking it out, going to a lot of effort to seek out these different states. And I remember as a teenager, I mean, it was partly because I was trying to escape myself, but altered states, even altered states that weren't very pleasant, I would seek out. Because I think just because it was something different. There's something about them, and we're hardwired for them in certain ways. So there's it's not just an altered state of there's some weird side phenomenon. I think it's a really uh profound aspect of who we are is this movement towards altered states of consciousness and perhaps even self transcendence. Terence McKenna famously in his book Food of the Gods suggested, I'm not suggesting this is true, but it's kind of interesting food for thought, is that, we co-evolve with psychedelic mushrooms. And in fact, my friend Richard Doyle, he published a book called Darwin's Pharmacy, in which he suggests also that psychedelics, what they did was they sort of almost increased the requisite variety of our brains. They functioned as a sexual selector. So by taking psychedelics, it expanded our brains to able to use language in certain ways that we could attract mates with, right?
Mm.
And perhaps I don't know, as a man, I know you have to, you have to use language in very clever ways in order to get a woman attracted to you. You got to be funny, you got to be funny and quick-witted, and having a sharp tongue in the sense of being able to, yeah, a silver tongue. It really helps you out.
Mm.
If you sound
Yeah.
daft or dumb, you don't get very far. So I think there's a complicated story here. Um, this is a long way of saying I'm certain those experiences sowed seeds for you in certain ways, because once you start having those experiences, it does broaden your sense of what reality is, even if you don't know it at the time. 15-year-old Athena or whatever it is on those mushrooms, you weren't thinking about the ontological consequences of your actions, um,
No.
or what it means for your epistemology of what reality is and so on. But it probably opens some doors. And I find that there is also a difference. One of the key ways people differ from each other is how open-minded they are. And some people, it's almost like a personality type, tend to be more closed-minded and rigid. They prefer their world to be like, okay, this is how I am, this is how you are, and this is how the world is, and that's just how it is. It's black and white, and they feel safe in that arena, in that kind of state. Whereas other people, they tend to feel more at home in a more fluid space. Um, where who you are can change. Who I am is a more fluid identity, is the sense of what the world is. You're much more comfortable with paradox and contradiction and fluidity in your interpretation of the world. You can hold multiple perspectives in your mind without contradiction or in a comfortable way. And those kinds of people tend to prefer psychedelics because obviously psychedelics accelerate that whole process. And I think in the process of development, in psychological development of human beings, as we actually evolve and grow cognitively, psychologically as a human being, you become more open-minded and you become more able to take on more diverse perspectives. So this is almost actually a development path, is going from a more rigid mind that can only handle limited perspectives to a much more open mind that can handle multiple perspectives. And that's the path towards greater freedom and well-being and happiness, towards literal wholeness, because as you take on more perspectives, you literally move towards wholeness. because as you take on total wholeness is all the perspectives together, right? uh, it's as many perspectives as you can possibly get. So the more perspectives you can take on, and you actually feel more and more, in a sense, whole. But of course, as you do that, you have to get less attached to each one. So there's a process of letting go of attachments as you go here, and psychedelics help this along the way, in a sense. So that's going quite probably a little bit deeper into the weeds than maybe you're anticipating on that one. But I find it very interesting how
Yeah,
that
me
kind of
too.
thing can happen.
Yeah, exactly. Me too. And then it just depends, yeah, like you said, like how far into spirituality you want to get. And I'm just wondering, for yourself, like I started extremely spiritual and like in my healing journey, I would say, and probably I was in my 20s, I would say, and just got really into the woo, like went totally out there and energy, we're all connected, we plan what we're going to do before we get to Earth kind of thing. And then it's like as get a little bit older and work through a little bit more things, it's like I really want to have that science basis and then bringing it kind of back to EP. It's like we learn, like you said, you learned that's trauma inside of you. And it's like you might not even think that you had trauma inside of you. And it's, your developmental, your attachment to your parents when you were young. And that's like scientifically proven. Like that's why we dissociate. That's why we have such trouble feeling our feelings and everything. And it's like really you can get I find now that I went down the scientific route and it's like I feel very like into research, into trauma, into this is why I have blocks and stuff. But now it's like I feel like now I'm coming full circle, especially through these podcasts, talking to people that have gotten me started in the beginning because it was a soul journey was my first little bit of healing. And then my next big clump of healing was hypnotherapy where you kind of journey into your subconscious and use that to access different parts of your past and stuff. And then now I went super scientific and now I feel like it's coming back around. But it's like I'm just wondering if you could talk to that balance kind of spirituality and scientific and how they kind of work
Yeah.
together or against each other.
So it depends a little bit what you mean by science and spirituality, because there is no fixed definition of either.
Yeah.
Um, but science is very helpful, of course. And the issue with it is it's limited and it has its own biases and ideologies and dogmas that go unrecognized by scientists or the scientific community or, science bro types, sort of the hyper rationalist types, which I used to be one of. I used to be a sort of a Richard Dawkins lover, this sort of atheist bro was in my teenage years. I did my like dissertation on the Spanish. I studied Spanish, and I did my dissertation on the Spanish Inquisition because I wanted to be this like super atheist guy who thought all
Hmm.
religion was stupid. But now I've learned that science, because science takes the objective to be the most important. It's just anything that you can't sort of measure um, is dismissed. Like subjective experiences are dismissed, which is why we end up in situations like our healthcare system where you could have been sexually abused as a child and a doctor won't ask you about your life and you've got migraines and your doctor won't join the dots between one and the other and they won't ask you about your history or anything that's happened to you and they'll just prescribe you some pills. And that's if the migraine could well be a psychosomatic symptom of trying to deal with the intensity of all the repressed emotions that you're carrying, right? But they will never find that out because they dismiss your internal experience of what it might have been like to go through that, what the internal impact would have been. That's all dismissed. Same with in science in general, your emotions, is are dismissed. Yet all of science relies on emotion. Like if you decide to study this thing over here and not that thing over there, that's not a scientific decision. It's an emotional decision. You feel drawn to. I want to study this thing over there. Why? That's a yes, desire. That's a subjective. And even when it comes to um, measuring things, science thinks everything's absolute. Yet Einstein's taught us that even measuring, this pen, it has no fixed length. It's not. It hasn't got a fixed color. It depends on how fast I'm traveling and how long this pen is. So science is great it has limits though, and this is why this is why it has a division with spirituality classically is because, in the East, the Buddhists, they've all been working on these systems of how to scientifically dissect your subjective experience, and noticing all these energies and emotions that can't be scientifically measured. Because you can't, for example, you can't actually scientifically measure the internal experience of anger, like your actual experience of it. I'm not talking about your palms going sweaty. I'm not talking about, you could probably, there might be greater electrical activity on the skin when you're angry and the hairs raise, but none of that's the experience of anger. Do you know what I mean? That's something internal that science can't actually measure or quantify. Yet anger clearly exists. So that's a really obvious example of the limits of science. Excuse me. So I think you can't rely on science. You have to rely on going there and discovering things for yourself to really find what's true. On the flip side, with spirituality, everything you're talking about, reincarnation and near-death experiences and coming back, choosing your own life. I've read a lot of accounts of that. I just read a book called Walk in the Physical, which was about a guy who remembered sort of memories of between lives. So I find it interesting. I tend to remain on the fence. I think it's possible that those things, there's a lot of evidence that those things are real. However, it depends what you mean by real, because real gets really fuzzy here. Again, if you want to really go into the weeds in this stuff, you realize that what's real is a problem because what's real or unreal is a projection of your own mind. It's actually a subjective experience that something is real or something's not real. And you can watch your mind play with this, and what you felt real can then be unreal and vice versa. Right? So it's what's real and people want to say, okay, just tell me what's real. But reality is more slippery than that. It's not got a simple binary between these things are real and these things are unreal, because we're interlinked with reality. We're kind of co-creating it with how we're interpreting it. We experience there's something there, but then we're interpreting what's there at the same time. And you can't ever separate those two and say, oh, this is definitely what's here. It's like the sort of problem of Schrodinger's cat. It's like you can't, is the cat alive or dead? It can be both at the same time until you open the box. But even then, alive is a human interpretation. Dead is a human interpretation. Before you learned language and you open the box, is the cat alive or dead? Before you know the words alive or dead. You know what I mean?
Mm.
So the problem with the NDEs and the whole I lived my life before it existed is it's also a very human interpretation. It's a story we're telling. It's patterns we're seeing in clouds in a certain sense. Because if you get a fox to experience the reality of uh time between lives, it won't interpret it as anything. It's only the human cognitive faculties that are telling this story. And so in a certain relative sense, okay, it's real, but in an absolute sense, it can never be real. It's not absolutely fundamental to reality in some absolute sense. Um, Again, I hope you're enjoying. I hope you like really going into the weeds of this stuff. Um,
Yeah. No, I think it's
so,
cool.
so, so I think I'm still figuring this one out myself. But there's a tension that what's difficult is it's very hard to. You've got to be very careful about where your own interpretation is coming in. And we need this interpretation to survive in the world. It's really useful. Like I need to interpret this as a pen, but I can't ever pin. I can't say this is a pen 100%. This is absolutely what it is. That's my interpretation that comes through my sense of self, right? It's a relative interpretation. So you've got to be really tricky, really careful with. I think a lot of people on podcasts, spiritual podcasts, they're taking their interpretation of what's happening and then they're saying this is an absolute thing, but it's not. It's a relative thing. And then the scientists on the flip side, they're saying they're not acknowledging the limits of science. And I think when there's room, I'd love these to come together if science acknowledges the limits of science and actually how there's a lot of emotional attachment to in it. There's a lot of bias and dogma around certain ideas, none of which has been proved scientifically. Like the limits, like science has not been scientifically proven to be unlimited and to be the only source of truth. That's something people take on faith. So I'd love to see science expand and then spirituality maybe get a little bit more sober and a little bit more hesitant about, okay, well, we've got these experiences of near death, we've got these experiences of that, and we interpret it as that. What does that mean, though? What's really going on?
Yeah, for sure. So, and also one thing that's brought up when you're saying this is reminds me of like the limitations we have with healing and like with doctors. And some people will say like, yeah, some people's are, my doctor says this, I need these pills, you know? And it's like I've heard you talk a bit before about like the fact that all of society would have to change in order for this type of like somatic healing to be taught in, in med school and everything. It's like, well then you wouldn't need pharmacists anymore kind of thing, like pills can help to a certain point, but it's like that disconnect between the scientific fact of this is your disorder, this is what we're naming what's going on for you kind of thing versus, kind of that holistic approach of maybe we can feel into why this is happening, why you have those migraines. And yeah, just a little bit of that. It just reminds me of the fact that yeah, in order for this to be incorporated, for everybody to kind of understand it, it's like all of society would have to change kind of the way we parent our kids, like now it's finally getting known that the cried out method was, a terrible thing that was invented because that's just traumatizing children. And yeah, but it's like so much would have to change in order to get, to get this attachment being the number one thing. So yeah, I don't know. It's just I don't know if you have any thoughts on that too, or if you can explain it a little bit better.
I think what you said was great.
Yeah,
It makes sense to me. Yeah, what you said at the beginning about the here's your diagnosis, here's the pills, here's the pharmacy. I get that's seemed to remind me of that kind of rigid mindset, sort of the rationalist
yeah,
mind likes to put things in neat boxes. But there's nothing rational or scientific about that. It makes them feel better. They're very
mhm,
uncomfortable with anything that's looser, that's more fuzzy, relative, which of course reality is that way. Reality is actually it's very loosey goosey. It's very relative. It's fuzzy. It can't ever be pinned down. Which is what sometimes some work through in spiritual domains can really teach that to you, like psychedelics or this kind of work. It can teach you of the nature of our interpretations, the way they're projected. They're very um, what's the word I'm looking for? Contingent on our kind of personal sense of self. It's very, how we experience reality is totally bound up with our sense of self. So that's just addressing that point again of this kind of the rigidity versus fuzziness, and that's quite difficult. Uh, yeah, we're trying to sort of get those two to meet in the middle. Because
mhm,
it's much easier for insurance companies and hospitals to say, yeah, exactly, you have this and this and this.
yeah,
Whereas when we go, well, you might have this and it might be linked to some trauma that might be in your past, or maybe it's the collective field at the minute. And, maybe some somatic work will work, but maybe you need psychedelic, it gets a lot more difficult, more complex. So I understand why people want to pin it down, but unfortunately, it's very reductionist. It just says here's the reality, which is big and complex and nebulous, and they ignore like 90% of it and say, no, it's just this. And in the ignoring of the 90%, turns out you lose something, basically.
yeah,
And then when it comes to changing society, I mean, yeah, I mean, I think I must have got that from Gabor Mate. That's his idea. We'd have to change everything. It's this simple idea that society is built by individuals and organizations and collectives. But those individuals and organizations have their own self agenda in mind when they're creating things. And so that creates a lot of imbalances. So it's like you might create schools, but that's the function is to create workers for factories. You want a certain standard of literacy in the population, so they can all work in your factories, and you can have a wealthy country. And it's not designed with those students in mind. And
yeah,
this has happened in many, many different ways where the institutions we have aren't really fit for the purpose they're meant to have because they never were designed for that purpose really in the first place, or at the very least, they always had an ulterior motive. Like schools don't just exist to educate people. There are ulterior motives going
mhm,
on. Just like people in government aren't necessarily selflessly sacrificing their lives for the public good. They quite like
yeah,
being prime minister or home secretary or whatever. There's something in that appeals to them. They get something too. And then
yeah,
if they're on the side, if they're a good home secretary or whatever, and they help some people, then that's a bonus. So yeah, there's all these different agenda. Each institution has its own kind of agenda that's going on, and we're kind of having to, when it comes to putting people first. you then have to start to change all that and go against all these vested interests, which it turns out is very difficult. So a classic example would be like in the US, I guess, these big pharma companies have a very powerful interest in people popping pills for the foreseeable
Yeah.
future and not turning to uh more holistic approaches that take into account people's subjective experiences and emotions and their nervous system and maybe even wider systemic oppression and issues like that because it starts to rub up against their interests and obviously these companies have a lot of money and they lobby the government and so on and
Yeah.
so it's almost like where do you begin? There's this whole system in place that kind of
Yeah.
everyone's kind of looks after themselves a little bit. And so at rock bottom, it's really simple. It's a matter of selfishness versus selflessness. If society is very
Hmm.
selfish, we get all these imbalances. And if the actors are all very selfish, we get these imbalances and people don't get looked after. And if we can create little pockets of selflessness, or move towards that's the only way to create a better society. There's no like, you don't need a better ideology. You don't need some political, in my opinion, at least, I would say you don't need some hitherto unthought of political ideology. Because even if we had the perfect ideology, the people we wouldn't be developed enough as human beings. Like we would be too selfish in a certain sense to really act on it. Because what if the perfect ideology was just love everyone as yourself? It's like I can't do that. What are you kidding? That would be the perfect ideology, right? There you go, sorted. Love
Yeah.
everyone as yourself. Then
Yeah.
if everyone can embody and live that, then there's no problem.
Yeah.
The big pharma companies would overnight have to be like, oh, sorry, everybody, we fucked up. Like we'll change all this stuff up because we weren't loving each other as ourselves. But it's really hard to do that because we're hardwired
Yeah.
to look after ourselves, and we're really afraid to tiny squishy beings. So this is why it's the inner transformation is for me is more important than the ideology or the approach.
Yeah, that makes
Because
sense.
it's that shift from selfishness to more selflessness, which I'm not suggesting there's anything. I'm not trying to judge people here for being too selfish. It's everyone's doing the best
Yeah.
that they can, but it's just a fact that that's kind of the root of the issue. Is simply people is a
Yeah.
selfishness, and the solution is selflessness, and very slowly moving in that direction. But that's a terrifying and difficult thing, which is why we're struggling with it.
Yeah, that makes sense. So it's basically what I'm hearing is like the individuals healing themselves it's is what's gonna like eventually help heal, our communities. It's like working on that selfishness within yourself is what's going to kind of the only way really that we can combat this whole life that we live in basically and economy and everything that's going on. Just wondering to wrap up quickly if you like how would you like I remember I know one of our in our sessions and everything one of the first thing we do is like build a resource and it's like so I'm just curious how do you feel like how would you go about feeling happy? Like how do you know you're feeling happy? I'm just wondering if you could talk to that just for a moment or two. Just like bring it back to our feelings and like how do you start, how do you start feeling your feelings basically? If you could say it in a nutshell. I know it's a huge thing, but
Okay, so you asked two questions. One about how do you be happy and how do you feel your feelings? Which one do you want me to answer?
yeah, well, like, yeah, like if someone just said, I want to feel happier, like, how would they start that? So, like, yeah, some advice for our listeners of how to start feeling your feelings and starting with maybe happiness.
Yeah, well, happiness is more of a byproduct, I would
Hmm.
say, of a number of other things in your life, one of which would be feeling your feelings. Because the reason why not feeling your feelings is problematic is that they tend to be cumulative. So when you experience painful, big feelings when you're small and you don't have the support to feel them, you 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 repress them and they don't disappear. They kind of stay lurking in your unconscious. And as you keep not, they keep trying to rise. And as you keep going through experiences, they rise and then you push them down again. If it feels like they're too much or you don't feel supported or safe enough to feel them. And this keeps on going. And you start getting lots of basically your body and mind have to start doing things, coping and getting coping mechanisms to deal with all these painful emotions, to hold them at bay, to numb out to them. which can include addictions. It can include, that's why your mind is going so fast. You're anxious about all different things. It's all being driven by the repressed emotions below. And that's why a lot of people, they want a quieter mind, right? That would be a big step towards happiness, right? And so a quieter mind is not, you don't get that by stopping thought, you by going to the roots of the thoughts. Like how if shame is being held really deep down, you'll notice there's rumination on how, oh, I'm not good enough, or there's comparing, lots of comparison with yourself and other people, or you're judging people a lot. Why? Only because there's a deep sense of shame there. If that shame lifts and you have no sense of being not good enough, then why compare yourself or judge other people? It's only a coping mechanism for this deeper pain. So as the pain starts to lift, you're processing these emotions, all those mental strategies start to die down, as there's a lot more peace in the mind. Plus, you get triggered less often. So when we're getting triggered, that's a past emotion. You're finding yourself in in a situation that echoes the environment or situation that that emotion was created in and repressed, and then it's coming up again to try and complete itself. So if you were a classic, if your dad would yell at you for not doing well enough at school, if you then get a boss who's kind of gives off daddy vibes, and they're upset with you because of the quality of your work, 30 years later, it'll bring up the same feelings you had when you were a kid, for example, right? And so that's sort of that side of things. That's why I probably can't go into the deep details of how to actually feel your feelings. I got some videos on my YouTube channel, which is called
Mhm.
Drunken Buddha, if anyone wants to check it out. But then there's a bigger part. I think you can't just feel your feelings in isolation. There's the wider circumstances of your life, which are important too. Like if you're in prison, you could feel your feelings and it'll help, but you still probably won't be very happy because you're in such a threatening and unsafe environment. And humans are very social beings. I think it's important having a bit of a sense of community and some good friends or family with whom you feel safe and you feel you can trust. I think that's really important, and that really supports those things support each other. So as you feel more feelings, you can actually become a bit more authentic, right? You might be people pleasing a little bit less, or you might be uh and that authenticity tends to draw you more towards the kind of people you really resonate with or really want to be friends with. Because before you're almost pretending to be someone else because of the layers of coping mechanisms give you this kind of fake personality that maybe you're people pleasing, or maybe you're trying too hard to be really and cool and aloof, or maybe you're trying really hard to be really successful, or and actually you're none of those things, actually. You're something completely different, deeper down. And so that authenticity that then helps you draw nearer or attract or resonate with people who you're more on your wavelength. And then that gives you the support that feeds back into the feeling of the feelings, right?
Yeah.
So that aspect is important too of the wider society, because a lot of people I know that they're in really difficult situations in their society. There's lots of systemic oppression, or there's people who are with misogyny and racism. These are very real things that affect everybody in society and make it harder. And so you can't just some people aren't in the position, and I'm somewhat guilty of making it sound like everyone should just sit by themselves and feel their feelings until everyone feels better, and it's not quite that simple.
No.
Some people, if you're raising two kids by yourself, you could just sitting down to feel your feelings is you need more support than that. But as you feel your feelings a little bit, maybe there's a bit more space to change your life, and then when you change your life, you can feel your feelings, and there's a bit of a virtuous circle going on. Um, and then what I think makes for a happy life is, as best as I know, being yourself. There's something about being yourself that just feels right. Um, Expressing yourself, being creative in whatever ways you want to be, living in the city that feels like the right place for you, having the friends that feel like the right place for you. There's something about that, but that it turns out that's really, really hard because you have to know yourself very deeply. And like I said, there are many parts of us that have had to come in to protect that are not really that we take to be ourselves, but are not really ourselves. They're these protections or coping mechanisms we've developed and then become really identified with. Like I was really identified with being a very intellectual person. And it's not that I'm not in a certain sense, but that identity that I was clinging to, and I was trying to read books that I didn't want to read because I felt like I should read them, and I was trying to present and talk in a certain way, use clever words because I felt like I should be using them to impress people, and it wasn't real, it's fake, and it felt fake, and probably people felt I was quite arrogant and annoying, and I was. uh, and even if you think that now, I'm at least less than I was before. Um, so yeah, so there's something about that as the goal, as something about being yourself. I feel that is about as close to happiness as you get.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Yeah, well, thank you so much, Ben. And like you mentioned, you have and I mentioned too that I watch like your whole YouTube channel and your website, drunkenbuddha.net. I'll link all of that in the show notes for sure. You'll tell me. And then if people want to go watch those videos and everything, and yeah, if you liked what we talked about, there's a whole lot more. And anyways, that was really awesome conversation. And yeah, and just another thing for me and for us together, it's just that whole like so non-judgmental in our sessions too, it's just like that safety I can feel to say anything in those sessions, and and it's just the way that you hold that space for me to be able to say those things and to talk through, and then that creates that safety and that openness to feel my feelings. And I have noticed like so many changes just in the 6 months, even just with this podcast, like I had such a strong feeling of unworthiness, and like, and nobody cares what I have to say, and so working through that is just, here's proof right here, and there's lots more proof out there as well. So yeah, I just wanted to say thank you, and thanks to our listeners and everything.
Well, I'm so glad, Athena. It's beautiful to see, and yeah, it's a brave move, putting yourself out there with the podcast. So that's yeah, well done. It's great
Yeah.
stuff.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, so if you guys want to work with Ben, I'll link everything in the show notes. Thanks, guys.
Okay, thank you.